About a month ago, Ruth asked if I would just talk about my faith journey, so at least that's how I think of it. And I started to collect my thoughts about this. I realized a couple of things. One is that if it were a movie script, it would be very short and very boring. But one of the things I really found interesting about this, about being asked to present about this, was that the last time I recall being asked to do so was something like about 1960. And that was when I was preparing for baptism. And it's just not, to me, it's a very personal topic. It's not one that I talk about. So it's been very interesting for me just going through the process of thinking about this. I'd like to think that my life has reflected my faith, but I just know that thinking about it is a very valuable thing to do. And then there are a few things that came out of this thinking that I'll touch on at the end. A few cautions, so to speak. I was born in Minneapolis in the 1940s, and I grew up there. When I was about 22, I left to go to the Navy. Vietnam was going on. I did my couple of tours, and then returned back to Minnesota, continued studies, and I took jobs away from the big city, that's in quotes, and working down in southeastern Minnesota, doing a couple of different things. I returned to Minneapolis for a number of reasons, but one of them was where my parents were in their life, their health conditions, and it just seemed like the right thing to do at the time. Then 10 years ago, we moved to Vermont, my wife Linda and I, and more recently to Maine. I was trying to think about sort of where I came from spiritually and emotionally, and my formative years had many multicultural influences. Home, Cub Scouts, schools, and various situations. While my father was born in Minneapolis, he was essentially first generation from parents who had immigrated in the 1890s. My mother was Australian and immigrated just a few years before my birth. And so there was a multicultural aspect that way, but then there was also the neighborhood that we were living in. The Cub Scout pack that I was in was very multicultural, with either one or two people of 4 different races. And it was just part of how we grew up. And the same was true with the schools that I went to. And then there was the influence of my mother, who I dearly loved. But she was very, very strict with certain kinds of courtesy codes. You know, always give up your seat to someone who is in greater need of it. I mean, there were a whole bunch of people on the list, but basically, if somebody was in greater need than you, give up your seat. And it's been one of those things that has just shaped me. Okay. On the other hand, there were some aspects of multiculturalism and provincialism that was really alive in the 1950s. When I was in about 3rd grade, a local grocery store had a promotion going on that included carnival rides. Well, that sounded pretty neat. And all we had to do was bring a note from one of our parents saying it was okay for us to go on the rides. And the person who read the note turned me down and said that no adult would ever write like this. And one of the things about the Australian schools is that they were encouraged to develop a very precise but personal penmanship. And it was sort of this lack of appreciation in the Midwest for other ways of being that stuck with me. It was one of those things. I was crushed. Anyway, my faith is heavily influenced by my parents and by a very large Baptist church in which I grew up. I was baptized at about 13. And there was a whole process, of course, that we went through, and that was, as I said, about the last time that I remember being asked this question. One of the distinctive features of that church was its Sunday school. It had Sunday school for all ages, sandwiched in between the first service and the second service. And as I say, it was for all ages and interests. Sometimes people moved between classes as they moved through life. Other times the class moved as a whole to a different stage of thought. And it was, there was always great conversation in the hallways. An example of the diversity: my father, a tractor builder, was classmates with a Manhattan Project mathematician and a professional wrestler. Yeah, and they talked religion. It was just a great environment. I can attribute one of my beliefs, and that is at times that the Bible is more metaphoric than literal, to be because of this mathematician. When he was talking about how he resolved the 7 days of creation as that you see it as stages or eras of development. You may or may not agree with me or him on that, but it's a way of viewing it that helps just bring it all together. During middle school years, and this would have been the couple years before and just the couple years after I was baptized, I participated in other services, often because of neighborhood or school friends, like the Lutheran Catechism studies, and went through that to try to get a little appreciation for that, and also crossed the street that we lived on. 5 houses in a row were Catholics, and so I kind of went and participated a little bit there, just to get a better understanding. And then there was the Methodist Church as well, which just completely incidentally is where Prince went, but that was after I went there. Okay. For the most part, I've lived a life that's pretty consistent with the values that I grew up with. I don't ever recall a serious questioning of faith. I can even say that I've often felt blessed, and there are times that I've felt that possibly a spiritual intervention has happened. And I mean, I say possibly because I don't know. I'll use as an example one time when I was sort of power walking down a road and I was going by a hedge, and I actually felt the wind of a vehicle before I saw it, and it just came to an abrupt stop. And it was that was possibly one time. There was another time that was, I don't want to go out to kind of Twilight Zone things, but I had some events happen in 1972. I'll get back to that in just a moment, actually. I don't want to suggest that my life has, however, only been rosy, because that's there have been some very tough years, and I don't want to drag out all kinds of things, but I think each of us have a year or two that we can identify as the tough ones. For me, it was 1972 and 2001, and possibly one other year, but those two far ahead. And I'm going to, some things happened to me, I'll just use 72 as the example. Things happened to me that year that I translated as lessons on life but no attack. They weren't an attack on the faith. And I think that's important. In fact, I believe with faith, it just greatly helps when you're dealing with the tough times of life. In 72, I had a series of events that challenged me. I went to war for the first time. A few months later, I had a stillborn child that was full term. My wife at that time nearly bled to death. I rushed back home. Later returned overseas to complete my tour. And when I did come back, I just wasn't accepted at home anymore. And you say, like, why me? But again, it wasn't a question of faith. It was a series of events that our faith helps us get through. And, so while I've never questioned my faith, I do believe faith is highly personal and something to be lived. And you may call it walking the talk or something like that. And as I was trying to summarize this, I was thinking that I have some fairly simple principles that I follow. And so be helpful, get the job done, be accepting of differences, to not be extravagant or wasteful, and to not accept double standards. And this is where I come back to some of the related thoughts. I think that some of our biggest challenges are are sort of societally based, where biggest challenges to leading a Christian life. It seems to me that sort of modern society, if I can call it that, accepts the difference between personal codes of conduct and business codes. And it's one of the places where I've always had a great personal difficulty. And there's a double standard here that I have trouble with. In fact, every week when we say the Lord's Prayer and lead us not into temptation, I consider this to be like one of the huge temptations that we're faced with all the time. And it's the challenge to us as Christians is to essentially to see how much we buy into the various notions and come up with our own interpretation. I can't tell you that my way is the way everyone else should be. It's just something. I've made career changes because I can't accept the double standards, and it's just to me it's one of the places where we live the faith. Is so I could go on to talk about something else, but I don't think I will. In conclusion, a question remains: does my life reflect my faith? And it would be really presumptuous of me to say that it does. But I do pray that it does. And so now this brings us to us. I have difficulty with organizations, but I find this church to have a really good spirit. And I enjoy participating here. And I'm looking forward to better getting to know and participate in ways that I can. So that was what I have. I don't know if you want questions or like that. Yeah. So thank you.